Welcome to the Midnight Lesson. Tonight, we're stepping into the life of one of history's most controversial and fascinating figures, Napoleon Bonaparte. If you have ideas for future topics, drop them in the comments. Now, enjoy tonight's lesson. Chapter 1: The Outsider from Corsica. Napoleon Bonaparte was not born into the heart of France. He was born on an island, Corsica, a place that had its own identity, its own pride, and its own stubborn resistance to being ruled by anyone else. For centuries, Corsica had been fought over, traded and controlled by outsiders. Genoa had held it. Then France came for it. And by the time Napoleon arrived in the world in 1769, Corsica had only recently been absorbed into the French state. That detail matters. Because from the very beginning, Napoleon's story is not the story of a French prince or a Parisian noble raised in comfort and certainty. It is the story of someone who grew up on the edge of an empire, looking inward at a world that didn't fully accept him, and looking outward at a future he believed he could force into existence. Napoleon was born in Ajaccio, a coastal town where the sea and the mountains shape everything, including the mindset of the people who live there. Corsica was rugged. It was proud. It was deeply political. Families held long memories of conflict, loyalty, and betrayal. The island did not see itself as simply French, even if France now claimed it. Napoleon's family was not poor, but they were not powerful either. They belonged to a minor noble class, which meant something on Corsica, but it did not automatically translate to influence in France. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was educated and ambitious. He understood that France now controlled the island, and he saw opportunity in that fact. He wanted his children to rise through French systems, even if Corsicans around him resented French rule. That decision alone would shape Napoleon's life. Because Napoleon did not grow up feeling fully at home in Corsica, and he did not grow up feeling fully accepted by France. He lived in between. That in-between space is often where intense ambition grows, because it produces a kind of hunger that never quite shuts off. As a boy, Napoleon was not described as charming. He was not the type of child who naturally won over a room. He was intense, sensitive, proud. He held grudges, he remembered insults, and he carried himself like someone who believed he was meant for something bigger, even when nobody around him had any reason to agree. His early education on Corsica was modest, but his father pushed hard to secure opportunities through French connections. Eventually, Napoleon earned a scholarship to attend school in mainland France, a path that was designed to produce French officers, French administrators, and French leaders. But Napoleon was not French in the way the other boys were French. He spoke with a Corsican accent. He had a different name. Different manners. Different instincts. He was an outsider before he even opened his mouth. When Napoleon arrived in France as a young student, he entered a world that was colder than Corsica, both in climate and in spirit. The schools were strict. The boys came from families with deeper wealth and longer histories of influence. They carried themselves like they belonged there. Napoleon did not. He was mocked for his accent. He was mocked for his background. He was mocked for being from an island that many of them saw as backward. And in response, Napoleon did not try to win them over. He did not become the class clown. He did not become the social favorite. He did not soften himself to fit in. He became harder. He became quieter. He turned inward and sharpened his mind like a weapon. He read constantly. History, mathematics, geography, military theory. He absorbed information the way some people breathe air. He studied great commanders and past empires. He looked for patterns in human behavior and war. He paid attention to the structure of power. And slowly, a worldview began to form inside him, a belief that nations rise and fall based on force, discipline, and leadership. A belief that chaos is an opportunity. A belief that most people do not truly understand how fragile their world is until someone shows them. Even as a teenager, Napoleon had a reputation for being serious beyond his years. He could be stubborn, he could be blunt, he could be arrogant, but he was also disciplined, focused, and unusually capable at the subjects that mattered most in military life. At a time when many young men in officer training treated it like a status symbol, Napoleon treated it like a mission. He was not there to enjoy the experience. He was there to become something. Eventually, Napoleon attended the École Militaire in Paris, one of the most important military schools in France. This was the kind of place where the sons of noble families prepared for careers as officers, often expecting high positions based on birth. But Napoleon's advantage was that he did not have the luxury of expecting anything. He had to earn it, and in many ways that made him more dangerous than those who thought they were guaranteed a future. At the École Militaire, Napoleon specialized in artillery. This mattered more than it might sound like today. Artillery was not glamorous like cavalry. It wasn't associated with noble elegance. It was technical, mathematical, brutal. It required precision, timing, and calculation. It was about angles, distance, terrain, and logistics. It was the science of destruction. And Napoleon was excellent at it. Artillery also shaped the way he thought. It trained him to see the battlefield not as a romantic stage for heroism, but as a system, a machine, a problem to be solved. And once solved, the enemy collapses. In 1785, Napoleon graduated and became a second lieutenant in the French army. He was only 16 years old, already an officer, already stepping into a world where power could be taken if you knew how. But France, at that moment, still looked like an old-world kingdom. The monarchy stood above everything. The aristocracy dominated the highest ranks. The church held influence. The system felt permanent. Napoleon entered the army at the tail end of that old world, and he would soon witness its collapse. Napoleon's early military life was not immediately dramatic. He served in provincial garrisons. He spent time writing, studying, and thinking. He remained emotionally tied to Corsica, even as he built his career in France. In fact, for a while, Napoleon's loyalty was not fully with France at all. It was with Corsica. He admired Corsican resistance leaders, especially Pasquale Paoli, a revolutionary figure who had fought for Corsican independence. Napoleon even wrote about Corsican politics and dreamed of his homeland becoming truly free. But the problem was this. Corsica was small, France was enormous, and the kind of ambition Napoleon carried inside him did not fit easily into a small island's future. He was torn between identity and opportunity, between loyalty and destiny. And history was about to remove the need for him to choose, because in 1789 the French Revolution began. At first it did not look like the beginning of a new era. It looked like another political crisis, another wave of unrest, another conflict between the monarchy and the people. But the revolution would grow into something far more violent and transformative than most could imagine. It would tear down the old structures of power. It would break the aristocracy. It would shake Europe. And most importantly, it would create a new world where a man like Napoleon could rise. Because in the old France, the path to the top was guarded by birth. In the new France, the path to the top would be guarded by results. And Napoleon, more than almost anyone alive, understood how to produce results. As the revolution escalated, Napoleon watched closely. He saw the weakening of the monarchy. He saw the political factions tearing at each other. He saw the fear spreading among the elites. He saw the army becoming unstable, with officers defecting, resigning, or being purged. To many this looked like disaster. To Napoleon, it looked like an opening, a once-in-a-lifetime opening. But Napoleon was not yet a national hero, not yet a legend. He was still young, still obscure, still a minor officer in a country sliding into chaos. A man who did not simply live through history, a man who intended to command it. Napoleon's early life built him like steel. He was forged in exclusion. He was sharpened by humiliation. He was strengthened by discipline. He learned to rely on his own mind because he could not rely on connections. He learned to outwork others because he could not outshine them socially. He learned to plan, to calculate, to think in systems. And above all, he learned that power is not given. It is taken. In the years ahead, France would plunge into war with its neighbors. The revolution would devour its own leaders. The army would become the most important institution in the country. And in that storm, Napoleon Bonaparte would find the perfect environment for a man like him. Because chaos does not destroy everyone. Sometimes it selects someone, and Napoleon was about to be selected. Not by luck, not by fate, but by the exact combination of ambition, skill, and relentless will that had been growing inside him since he was a boy on Corsica, watching the waves crash against the shore and imagining a world larger than the island he came from. The midnight lesson continues in the next chapter, because the revolution is about to turn France into a battlefield, and Napoleon is about to step onto it. Chapter 2, Revolution Creates a Weapon. The French Revolution did not just change France, it changed what was possible. For centuries, power in Europe had followed a predictable pattern. Kings ruled by inheritance. Nobles commanded armies because of their names. The church shaped society because it was embedded into the structure of government itself. The system was not perfect, but it was stable enough that most people believed it would last forever. Then the revolution came, and in a matter of years, the old order didn't simply weaken. It shattered. By the early 1790s, France was no longer a kingdom trying to reform itself. It was a nation tearing itself apart, stripping away every symbol of tradition, and trying to rebuild a new society from the ground up. But revolutions don't happen neatly. They don't stay controlled. They don't politely remove one system and replace it with another. They unleash something raw in human nature. Fear, rage, hope, revenge, hunger, pride. And once that energy is released, it spreads like fire. The monarchy fell. King Louis XVI was executed. The Queen followed him to the guillotine. Aristocrats fled the country or were dragged into prison. Anyone suspected of being against the revolution could be arrested, denounced, or killed. Political factions turned on each other. The revolution became a machine that demanded enemies, and the more it consumed, the more it demanded. This period became known as the Terror, a time when the government ruled through suspicion and violence, convinced that the survival of the revolution required constant purification. France was surrounded by hostile powers. Austria and Prussia feared the revolution's influence spreading into their own territories. Britain watched with alarm. Spain and other monarchies looked at France like a disease that had to be contained. Soon, France was at war with much of Europe, and inside France, civil war erupted in regions that resisted the revolution's new order. It was chaos on every front. For most people, this was a nightmare. For Napoleon Bonaparte, it was a ladder, because when the old system collapses, it takes its gatekeepers down with it. And suddenly, ability matters more than background. Napoleon was still a young artillery officer. He was not a famous name. He was not a political leader. He was not a general. He was not wealthy. He was not connected to the highest circles. But he had something rare. He understood the mechanics of war. And more importantly, he understood the mechanics of power. In a time of revolution, the army becomes everything. It becomes the shield of the government. It becomes the instrument of survival. It becomes the tool that decides who lives and who falls. And Napoleon was a man built for that environment. He was methodical. He was focused. He was aggressive. He was calm under pressure. He was willing to make decisions quickly. He had the mind of an engineer and the instincts of a gambler. But his rise was not guaranteed. In fact, at first, Napoleon's position was unstable. He had ties to Corsica. He had written about Corsican independence. He had supported Corsican political movements. And as the revolution intensified, the politics of Corsica became tangled in France's larger crisis. Napoleon returned to Corsica and tried to work within the island's shifting political landscape. For a time, he still imagined himself serving Corsica first, not France. But the island was divided. Pasquale Paoli, the leader Napoleon once admired, began to oppose the radical direction of the French Revolution. Paoli moved toward separation from France, and his supporters grew hostile toward those who remained loyal to the French Republic. Napoleon's family became caught in the middle. The situation turned dangerous fast, and eventually Napoleon's break with Paoli became complete. He and his family were forced to flee Corsica. They left behind the island that had formed him. And in doing so, Napoleon made a choice. Even if it wasn't fully voluntary, he would now belong to France. Not because France welcomed him, but because France was the only stage large enough for the future he wanted. By 1793, France was fighting for survival. The revolution was under threat from foreign armies, internal rebellions, and political purges. And in the south of France, one of the most serious threats emerged. Toulon was not just any city. It was a strategic naval base, a critical port, a place where France's Mediterranean fleet was anchored, and in 1793, Toulon turned against the revolutionary government. Royalist forces inside the city revolted, and they invited Britain and other foreign powers to intervene. The British arrived with ships. Foreign troops entered the port. Suddenly, Toulon became a dagger pointed at the Republic's chest. If the revolution lost Toulon, it would lose more than a city. It would lose prestige. It would lose naval power. It would send a message to every enemy of the revolution that France could be carved apart. So the revolutionary government did what it always did when threatened. It demanded results. An army was sent to take Toulon back. But there was a problem. The French forces were disorganized. The officers were unreliable. Some had fled. Some had been executed. Some were inexperienced replacements. And the siege dragged on. This is where Napoleon entered the story. Not as a hero yet, not as a commander of armies, but as a specialist, an artillery officer with a mind built for exactly this kind of problem. Napoleon was assigned to the siege of Toulon, and almost immediately he saw what others weren't seeing. The key to Toulon was not simply storming the city. The key was controlling the harbor. The British fleet was the lifeline of the defenders. As long as the British ships could supply and reinforce Toulon, the city could hold out. So Napoleon focused on one question: how do you force the British to leave? His answer was simple. You don't attack the city first. You take the high ground that dominates the port. You place artillery there, and you make the harbor unusable. This was not a romantic plan. It was not about bravery. It was about geometry. It was about physics. It was about making the enemy's position impossible to maintain. Napoleon pushed hard for this strategy. He argued. He planned. He positioned guns. He reorganized artillery placements. He created batteries. He coordinated fire. He treated the siege like a machine that needed to be engineered correctly. And when the French finally assaulted the key positions, Napoleon was there in the thick of it, directing artillery, pushing the plan forward, refusing to let the moment slip away. The assault succeeded. The French gained the high ground. The harbor came under heavy fire. And the British fleet, now vulnerable, withdrew. Without British support, Toulon could not hold. The city fell. France reclaimed its port. The revolution survived another major threat, and Napoleon Bonaparte, at only 24 years old, became the man credited with making it happen. This was the moment his life changed, because revolutions don't reward loyalty. They reward usefulness, and Napoleon had just proven that he could deliver something the revolution desperately needed: victory. The revolutionary government promoted him to brigadier general. That kind of leap was almost unheard of in the old system. But the old system was dead. This was the new France. A France where a man with talent could rise faster than tradition could stop him. Toulon also taught Napoleon something deeper. It taught him that war was not just about fighting. It was about perception. The story of Toulon spread. Napoleon's role was emphasized. His success became a narrative. A symbol of the revolution producing its own champions. Napoleon learned that if you win, and if you make sure people know you won, you become more than a soldier. You become a political asset, and in revolutionary France, political assets were everything. But even after Toulon, Napoleon's position was still dangerous. Because revolutionary politics were unstable, one faction could rise, and the next day be executed. One leader could praise you, and the next week be accused of treason. Napoleon had connections to political figures who could fall at any moment. And when they fell, their allies often fell with them. At one point, Napoleon was arrested, not because he had failed in battle, not because he had betrayed anyone, but because the shifting political winds made him suspicious. In the revolution, suspicion was enough. Napoleon spent time imprisoned, uncertain if he would be executed like so many others. His career, his future, his life could have ended right there, but he survived. He was released. And once again he returned to what he always returned to: study, planning, waiting for the next opening, because Napoleon understood something most people never fully understand. History is not a straight line. It is a series of moments, and if you are ready when the moment arrives, you can leap. The French Revolution had created the conditions for Napoleon's rise, but it had not yet made him unstoppable. Not yet. He was still a young general in a country tearing itself apart, surrounded by enemies, filled with fear, and desperate for stability. But the revolution had done one crucial thing. It had transformed Napoleon from a talented outsider into a weapon that France would soon need again. because in the next chapter, the chaos of France would come to Paris itself, and Napoleon would find himself standing in the center of it, not on a battlefield far away, but in the capital, where politics, violence, and power collided, and where one decision could turn a man into a legend. Chapter 3, The General Who Saved Paris. By 1795, France was exhausted, not just tired in the normal sense, but worn down at the deepest level. The revolution had been burning for years, and it had taken something from everyone. It had taken lives, stability, trust, and any sense that tomorrow was guaranteed. The monarchy was gone. The old nobility was shattered. The church had been attacked and stripped of power. And the revolutionary government had become something it never intended to become. A system held together by fear, emergency measures, and constant violence. The terror had passed its peak, but it had left scars everywhere. People had watched neighbors disappear. Families had been split. Entire cities had been punished. And even those who supported the revolution were beginning to feel a new kind of dread. Not fear of kings, but fear of the revolution itself. Because once a society learns to solve problems through force, it becomes difficult to stop using force. France needed stability. It needed control. It needed to breathe again. And in 1795, the government trying to hold France together was the Directory, a new ruling body meant to prevent dictatorship and prevent a return to monarchy. It was supposed to be balanced, practical, modern, but it was also weak and constantly threatened. There were enemies on every side, radicals who believed the revolution had lost its purity, royalists who believed the revolution had gone too far and needed to be undone. Common people who were starving, angry, and tired of being told to sacrifice more. And the army, the one institution that still had discipline and strength, was becoming the real power behind the government. In this unstable world, Paris was the center of everything. Paris was not just a capital. It was a symbol. If Paris fell into chaos, the whole revolution could collapse. And in October of 1795, Paris came dangerously close to doing exactly that. A large royalist uprising formed, made up of thousands of men, many of them armed, many of them determined. Their goal was simple. They wanted to overthrow the Directory. They wanted to reverse the revolution. They wanted power back, and they believed the government was too weak to stop them. The uprising was not a small riot. It was a serious threat, a force large enough to crush the government if it succeeded. Because if they lost Paris, they lost everything. The government did not have time for debate. It did not have time for politics. It needed a commander, someone who could act fast without hesitation. This was the kind of moment that creates legends, and it was the kind of moment Napoleon Bonaparte had been waiting for. At this point, Napoleon was a young general with a growing reputation, but he was not secure. He was not at the top. He was not in command of major armies. He was not one of the most powerful men in France. He was capable, and he was known. But he was still replaceable, still vulnerable, still one mistake away from disappearing into the chaos like so many others. Then the uprising happened, and suddenly the Directory needed someone exactly like him. Napoleon was given responsibility for defending the government, and the first thing he did was not inspirational. It was practical. He secured the artillery. This is one of the most important patterns in Napoleon's life. Whenever he faced danger, he looked for the leverage point, not the loudest threat, not the most emotional target, the leverage point. In Paris, that leverage point was cannons. Napoleon understood something about crowds and street fighting that many leaders did not. If thousands of armed men were marching toward the government, you could not stop them with scattered infantry alone. You needed concentrated power. You needed something that could break the momentum of an advancing mass. You needed artillery. But artillery in a city was also dangerous politically. Using cannons against citizens could turn public opinion against the government. It could make the Directory look like tyrants. It could create backlash. Napoleon did not care, not because he enjoyed violence, but because he understood the situation with cold clarity. If the Directory fell, France would collapse into another wave of civil war and counter-revolution. If the Directory survived, it would owe its survival to whoever saved it. And Napoleon intended to be that man. He sent a young officer named Joachim Murat to seize the cannons before the royalists could take them. Murat succeeded. The artillery was secured. Napoleon positioned the guns in key locations around the government's defenses, especially near the Tuileries and other strategic points. He didn't spread his forces thin, he concentrated them. He prepared for one thing: the moment the crowd committed to the attack. On October 5th, 1795, the royalists advanced, thousands of them, marching toward the government, believing the Directory would crumble, believing they could overwhelm the defenders by sheer numbers. Napoleon waited until they were close enough. Then he gave the order. The cannons fired. Not warning shots, not intimidation, real fire, grape shot. A brutal type of ammunition that turned artillery into a wide spray of metal designed to tear through ranks of men at close range. It was devastating. In moments, the advancing royalist force was shattered. The uprising collapsed. The streets cleared. The threat to the government ended almost as quickly as it began. It was not a heroic duel. It was not a dramatic sword fight. It was not a long battle. It was a blunt, violent, efficient decision, and it worked. The Directory survived. Paris stayed under government control. And Napoleon Bonaparte became the man who had saved the revolution's government with what many later described as a whiff of grape shot. That phrase would follow him forever, because it captured something essential about Napoleon. He was not sentimental. He was not hesitant. When he believed something had to be done, he did it. And he accepted the consequences. To some, Napoleon's actions were shocking, using artillery against fellow Frenchmen, killing citizens in the streets. It felt like the revolution turning its weapons inward again. But to the Directory, it was salvation, and the Directory rewarded him. Napoleon was given command of the Army of the Interior, effectively making him responsible for security in Paris. That was not a small promotion. It meant he was now a key military figure in the capital, at the center of politics, surrounded by power. It also meant that Napoleon had crossed a threshold. He was no longer just a talented officer who won battles. He was now a political actor, a man who could decide the fate of governments, a man who had proven he could control a crisis. And in revolutionary France, that was the rarest skill of all. Around this time, Napoleon's personal life also began to shift. He met Josephine de Beauharnais, a woman older than him, socially connected, charming, and experienced in the dangerous world of revolutionary politics. Josephine was not just a romantic interest, she was a bridge. She had relationships and connections Napoleon didn't have. She knew how the salons worked, how the political circles moved, how influence was traded. Napoleon, for all his brilliance, was still an outsider in high society. Josephine helped him enter that world, and Napoleon, in return, offered something she needed: protection, a future. A man rising fast enough that being close to him could mean survival, and in many ways that marriage symbolized the new Napoleon. He was no longer simply the Corsican outsider. He was becoming part of France's ruling class, not by birth, but by force of momentum. The government had survived a royalist threat, but France was still at war with Europe. The Directory needed victories abroad to strengthen itself at home. It needed generals who could win, not just defend Paris. Napoleon was now in a perfect position to be used. And Napoleon was eager to be used, because every war meant more opportunity. Shortly after suppressing the uprising, Napoleon was given command of the Army of Italy. This was a major assignment. Italy was one of the main fronts against Austria, one of France's most powerful enemies. The Army of Italy had been neglected, underfunded, and treated as a secondary force. Many saw it as a difficult job, a mess, a struggle. Napoleon saw it as a stage, because Napoleon did not measure opportunity by comfort. He measured it by visibility. If he could take a weak army and turn it into a victorious one, he wouldn't just gain a promotion, he would gain a myth. And myths are stronger than titles. So Napoleon left Paris. He left behind the political center of France. But he did not leave behind the power he had gained, because now France knew his name. The government trusted him, the army respected him, and the public, whether they loved him or feared him, had begun to understand something. This young general from Corsica was not ordinary. He was the kind of man who could change the direction of events. And now he was heading into Italy, where he would fight not just battles but the future of Europe itself. The midnight lesson continues in the next chapter. Because Italy is where Napoleon stops being a rising star and becomes a legend, Chapter 4, Italy and the Birth of a Legend. When Napoleon Bonaparte took command of the Army of Italy in 1796, it was not a glamorous assignment. In fact, many officers would have seen it as a punishment. The Army of Italy was underpaid, underfed, and overlooked. It was not the prized army on the Rhine facing the main Austrian forces. It was not the army closest to Parisian attention. It was the army stationed in harsh terrain, operating in the mountains and valleys of northern Italy where supply lines were fragile and conditions were brutal. The soldiers were tired, their uniforms were worn, their morale was low, and their confidence in the government that sent them there was even lower. But Napoleon looked at that army and saw something different. He saw raw material. He saw an instrument waiting to be sharpened, and he saw a stage that was wide open, because the army of Italy had one advantage. It was expected to struggle. That meant any victory would look like a miracle. Napoleon arrived and immediately began to do what he always did. He imposed focus. He imposed energy. He imposed direction. He spoke to his men in a way they weren't used to hearing from officers. He didn't speak like a distant aristocrat. He spoke like someone who understood hunger, hardship, and the need to win. He promised them glory. He promised them wealth. He promised them that Italy would feed them, reward them, and make them famous. And he did not speak as if it was a hope. He spoke as if it was a certainty. The men listened, not because Napoleon was tall or imposing. He wasn't. Not because he was charming. He often wasn't. They listened because he sounded like someone who believed in victory so completely that doubt seemed like weakness. Napoleon also understood something about armies. Morale is not just emotional. It is logistical. If men are hungry, they lose discipline. If they feel abandoned, they lose loyalty. If they think they are being wasted, they lose the will to fight. So Napoleon moved quickly to secure supplies, to reorganize command, and to give his army what it needed most: momentum. In northern Italy, France faced two main enemies: the Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont, which controlled parts of northwest Italy, and Austria, the great imperial power that held territories in Italy and saw the revolution as a threat to the entire European order. The enemy forces were positioned to contain France. They expected a slow, grinding campaign. They expected the French to struggle in the mountains. They expected a young general to fail. Napoleon did not give them that campaign. He attacked fast. He attacked with precision. He attacked in ways that felt almost reckless but were actually calculated. His strategy in Italy was built around one central idea: do not let the enemy combine their forces. So Napoleon moved like a blade between them, striking one, then the other, before they could respond. In April 1796, Napoleon launched his offensive. Within days, he was winning. Battle after battle, he pushed the enemy back, using speed and concentration of force to create local superiority even when he was outnumbered overall. He understood terrain. He understood timing. He understood that war is not about equal strength. It is about applying strength at the right place, at the right time. The Sardinians were hit hard, they broke, and they sued for peace. In a matter of weeks, Napoleon had removed one enemy from the war. That alone would have been impressive. But Napoleon was not satisfied with removing enemies. He wanted to destroy them. He turned his attention fully to Austria. Austria was the real prize. Austria was the power that mattered, and Austria was the opponent that would make his name echo across Europe. Napoleon pushed deeper into Italy, fighting Austrian forces along rivers, through cities, across bridges, and over open fields. One of the most famous moments came at the Battle of Lodi. The details of Lodi would become part of Napoleon's legend. The French needed to cross a bridge under heavy enemy fire. It was a dangerous, exposed assault. Many would have hesitated. Napoleon did not. The French stormed the bridge and forced the Austrians to retreat. In the moment, it was a tactical victory, but in Napoleon's mind, it was something else. It was proof. Proof that he could win battles through willpower and speed. Proof that fear could be overcome by force of decision. Later, Napoleon would say that Lodi was the moment he began to believe he was destined for greatness, that he was not just a general, but someone meant to shape history. As Napoleon's victories continued, his reputation grew faster than his army could march. In France, the Directory needed victories to survive politically. Napoleon was giving them victories. In Italy, local rulers and populations began to realize that the French were not simply raiding forces. They were conquerors. They were reshaping the political landscape. Napoleon took city after city, forcing concessions, demanding resources, and extracting wealth. He also did something that made him different from many commanders of his era. He paid attention to image. He issued bulletins that exaggerated victories, glorified the army, and highlighted his own leadership. These bulletins were sent back to France, where they were printed, read, and spread. Napoleon was not just winning battles. He was building a narrative, and narratives are power. As he moved through Italy, Napoleon began to negotiate directly with defeated enemies, often without waiting for approval from the Directory. This was a sign of something important. Napoleon was beginning to act like an independent ruler, not officially, not yet. The Directory wanted a general. Napoleon was becoming something more. He established new sister republics in Italy, political entities aligned with France, often presented as liberated states but functioning as French satellites. He took art and treasures from Italy and sent them to France both as trophies and as proof that the revolution could produce cultural dominance, not just military dominance. He understood symbolism. He understood that conquering a nation was not just about armies, it was about identity. And he wanted France to feel that it was rising into a new era of greatness. Meanwhile, Austria struggled to stop him. They sent new armies, they reinforced positions, they tried to slow him down. But Napoleon kept winning. He fought at Castiglione, Arcole, Rivoli. Each battle strengthened the myth. Each battle made him seem less like a man and more like an unstoppable force. By 1797, Napoleon's campaign had reached a point where Austria was no longer simply losing in Italy. Austria was threatened at its core. Napoleon pushed toward Vienna. The idea that a French revolutionary general could threaten the heart of the Habsburg Empire was almost unthinkable just a few years earlier. Austria sued for peace. The result was the Treaty of Campo Formio. It was a major diplomatic victory for France. It reshaped territory, it weakened Austria, and it elevated Napoleon into a new category. He was now one of the most famous men in Europe, not because he held a throne, not because he had royal blood, but because he had done something that few believed was possible. He had taken a neglected army, marched it into Italy, defeated major powers, redrawn borders, and returned as a hero. But here is the most important part. Napoleon's Italian campaign did not just make him famous, it made him dangerous. Because the Directory now faced a problem. They had created a general who was too successful, a man with an army loyal to him personally, a man with public support, a man who had proven he could defeat foreign enemies and crush domestic threats. And in revolutionary France, where governments rose and fell quickly, that kind of man could become the government. Napoleon began to realize this too. In Italy, he had tasted independent authority. He had negotiated treaties. He had controlled territories. He had managed wealth. He had seen how quickly political leaders could bend when faced with military reality. When Napoleon returned to France, he was not just returning as a general, he was returning as a national figure, a symbol of victory, a symbol of order, a symbol of what France could become. But also, a man who could not easily be controlled, and the Directory, whether they admitted it or not, understood something. Napoleon was no longer simply their servant, he was becoming their rival. The midnight lesson continues in the next chapter, because the next step in Napoleon's story is not Italy, it is Egypt, a campaign that would test his ambition, his image, and his ability to survive failure. And it would prove something that might be even more important than victory, that Napoleon could lose and still rise. Chapter 5, Egypt, Disaster and Genius Marketing. By 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte had become something France had not seen before. Not just a successful general, not just a talented officer, but a public figure, a national symbol, a man whose victories had reshaped Italy, humiliated Austria, and made France feel unstoppable. And in revolutionary France, that kind of popularity was dangerous. Because the Directory, the five-man government ruling France, was unstable and widely disliked. It survived by balancing factions, suppressing unrest, and depending heavily on military success to keep legitimacy alive. Napoleon's Italian victories had helped them survive, but those same victories had created a new threat. Napoleon himself. He was young, he was ambitious, he had the attention of the public, and he had the loyalty of soldiers who believed he could lead them to glory and wealth. In a country that had already executed a king, and seen governments rise and collapse in rapid succession, the idea of another strongman taking control was not far-fetched. The Directory did not want Napoleon in Paris, not because they could openly oppose him, but because they feared him. They feared what might happen if he stayed close to the political center, surrounded by newspapers, crowds, and influential allies. They feared he would become too powerful to manage. So they did what governments often do when they feel threatened by a popular commander. They sent him away. But they needed to do it in a way that sounded like an honor, not an exile. The solution was Egypt. The idea was bold on paper. France could not easily invade Britain directly. The British Navy controlled the seas, and any attempt to land troops on British soil was likely to fail. But Britain's power depended on trade, especially trade routes to India and the East. If France could threaten Britain's access to those routes, it could weaken Britain without having to fight a direct invasion. Egypt, sitting at the crossroads between Europe, Africa, and Asia, seemed like the perfect place. A French presence in Egypt could disrupt British commerce. It could open new influence in the Mediterranean. It could give France a colonial foothold, and it could distract Napoleon with a grand adventure far from Paris. Napoleon accepted the mission. Some historians argue he wanted it because it offered a new kind of glory, something beyond Europe. Others argue he saw it as a stepping stone, a way to build an even larger reputation and return stronger than before. In truth, it was probably both. Napoleon did not think small, he never had. He believed he was meant for greatness, and Egypt offered the kind of stage where greatness could be manufactured. But Napoleon also understood something critical. If he was going to leave France and risk his reputation on a distant campaign, he needed more than soldiers. He needed a story, so he brought scholars, scientists, engineers, artists, historians, men of learning who could study Egypt, map it, document it, and present the expedition as more than a military conquest. This was unusual. European powers often conquered and plundered, but Napoleon wanted to wrap conquest in the language of enlightenment and discovery. He wanted to present himself not only as a warrior, but as a leader of civilization, a man expanding knowledge as well as power. In May 1798, Napoleon sailed from France with a large expedition force. The fleet moved across the Mediterranean and captured Malta on the way, another strategic prize. Then the Armada continued toward Egypt. In July, Napoleon's forces landed near Alexandria. The heat was crushing. The terrain was unfamiliar. The water was scarce. Many soldiers were already exhausted before the campaign truly began. But Napoleon pushed forward quickly as he always did. His enemy in Egypt was not just the local population. It was the Mamluks. The Mamluks were the military elite that effectively ruled Egypt, even though Egypt was technically part of the Ottoman Empire. They were skilled cavalry fighters known for speed, bravery, and shock tactics. They were not European-style armies with disciplined infantry formations and heavy artillery. They were something different, and Napoleon knew exactly how to exploit that difference. The most famous early battle of the campaign was the Battle of the Pyramids. Napoleon's soldiers marched inland toward Cairo, where the Mamluk forces gathered to stop them. The Mamluks were confident. Their cavalry was legendary. They expected to overwhelm the French in open combat. Napoleon did not fight the battle the way the Mamluks expected. He formed his infantry into large square formations, each square protected by bayonets and supported by artillery. Cavalry charges could not break those squares easily. Every time the Mamluks charged, they ran into walls of disciplined firepower. The result was devastating. The French won decisively. The Mamluks suffered heavy losses. Cairo fell under French control. Napoleon declared victory, and in that moment it looked like the expedition was a success. France had conquered Egypt. Napoleon had defeated a famous warrior class, and he was now in control of one of the most important regions in the eastern Mediterranean. But that victory contained a problem that Napoleon could not solve with battlefield genius: the sea. Napoleon's army was in Egypt, but its lifeline was the fleet. Supplies, reinforcements, communication with France, and the ability to retreat if necessary all depended on naval control, and France did not have that control. Britain did. The British Navy, led by Admiral Horatio Nelson, pursued Napoleon's fleet. In August 1798, Nelson found the French ships anchored in Aboukir Bay, near the Nile Delta. What followed was one of the most catastrophic naval defeats in French history, the Battle of the Nile. Nelson attacked with precision and aggression. The French fleet was destroyed or captured. Ships burned in the water. Explosions lit up the night. France lost the naval power it needed to support the expedition, and Napoleon in Egypt was suddenly trapped. This was the turning point, because Napoleon had won on land, but he had lost the sea, and without the sea, his campaign was no longer a grand strategy against Britain. It was a stranded army in hostile territory. News of the naval disaster spread quickly. Napoleon's soldiers realized what it meant. They were cut off. Supplies would become harder. Escape would be uncertain. The campaign's long-term survival was now questionable, but Napoleon did not panic publicly. He did what he always did. He controlled the narrative. He emphasized victories. He minimized setbacks. He presented the expedition as stable, confident, and purposeful, even when reality was turning against him. This is one of the most important lessons of Napoleon's career. He understood that perception could sometimes matter more than facts. Not because facts were irrelevant, but because people often experience reality through the stories they are told. A leader who controls the story can hold power longer than a leader who simply tells the truth. Napoleon also tried to stabilize Egypt politically. He presented himself as a liberator from Mamluk oppression. He attempted to win over local religious leaders. He used proclamations designed to appeal to Muslim populations, even claiming respect for Islam and portraying France as an ally against corruption. These efforts had mixed results. Some Egyptians cooperated, many resisted, and soon the French faced uprisings. Cairo itself erupted in rebellion. The French response was harsh. They crushed resistance with force, killing insurgents and restoring control through intimidation. Napoleon could speak of enlightenment and civilization, but he was still an occupying commander, and occupation always produces resistance. Meanwhile, the wider geopolitical situation worsened. The Ottoman Empire, alarmed by the French invasion of Egypt, prepared to fight back. Russia and Austria also moved against France in Europe. A new coalition formed. Napoleon's expedition, originally meant to weaken Britain, now threatened to become a strategic dead end. Napoleon decided to strike again, moving north into Syria in early 1799, aiming to defeat Ottoman forces before they could invade Egypt. It was an ambitious move, but it revealed something important. Napoleon was trying to force a win out of a situation that was no longer favorable. In Syria, the French captured some towns, but they struggled with disease, supply shortages, and stubborn resistance. The siege of Acre became a major obstacle. The city held out. British support helped its defenders. Napoleon could not break it, and for the first time in years, Napoleon faced a clear failure. He withdrew. His army suffered. The campaign lost momentum. Napoleon returned to Egypt, but the expedition's glory had faded. It was still alive, still fighting, still holding territory, but it was no longer unstoppable. Back in France, the Directory was weakening further. Military setbacks in Europe damaged confidence. Political instability grew. The government was losing control. Napoleon received news of this crisis, and he made a decision that would define him. He left Egypt. He did not ask permission. He did not wait for a perfect exit. He boarded ships and sailed back to France in 1799, leaving his army behind. To critics, this looked like abandonment. To Napoleon, it was survival. Because Napoleon's true goal was never Egypt itself. His true goal was power, and France, he knew, was where power could be taken. Here is the most striking part. How? Because most French people did not experience Egypt through military reports. They experienced it through Napoleon's story, through his bulletins, through carefully crafted messaging, through selective emphasis on victories like the Battle of the Pyramids, while minimizing disasters like the Battle of the Nile. Napoleon had mastered something rare. He could lose strategically and still win politically. He arrived in France at exactly the right time. The government was weak. The people were tired. The army wanted leadership. And Napoleon's reputation, even after Egypt, was still strong enough to make him the obvious solution. In the next chapter, Napoleon will do what many suspected he always intended to do. He will stop serving governments, and he will become the government. Because in 1799, France is about to be reshaped again, not by revolutionaries, not by kings, but by one man. Chapter 6, The Coup of 1799. When Napoleon returned to Paris, he came back. The revolution was still alive, but it had shape. The revolution was still a lism and the promise of a new world. It was now a tired, battered political system, and instability had worn down the public. The excitement of revolution had been replaced by exhaustion. France wanted one thing more than anything else: order. The Directory, the government that ruled France, was weak. It was corrupt. It was constantly threatened by internal plots and external enemies. Its leaders were unpopular, and they knew it. Their power depended on keeping factions divided and keeping the army loyal, but even that loyalty was becoming uncertain. The economy was unstable. Prices rose. The value of currency fluctuated. Food shortages caused anger, and every political decision seemed to create new enemies. France was still fighting major wars across Europe. The victories of earlier years were fading, replaced by setbacks. The coalition powers were pressing hard. The sense of unstoppable momentum that had once fueled revolutionary confidence was slipping away. This was not a nation that felt secure. It was a nation looking for someone to stabilize it. Napoleon understood this immediately. He also understood something else. The Directory did not truly control France anymore. It managed France, it reacted to France, but it did not command France. And in a crisis, the man who commands becomes the man who rules. Napoleon had returned at exactly the right moment, and he knew it. He did not come back quietly. He arrived as a celebrity. Crowds gathered. People spoke of him with hope and admiration, even if they didn't fully understand what he wanted. The myth of Napoleon was still intact. Italy had made him famous. Egypt had been spun into glory, and his absence from Paris had made him seem untouched by the government's failures. He appeared like an answer that had been waiting in the background. But Napoleon did not rush blindly into power. He did what he always did before a major move. He studied the battlefield, except this time the battlefield was political. The Directory was divided, and one of its members, Emmanuel Joseph Size, was already planning change. Size was a revolutionary figure who believed the current system was unworkable. He wanted a new constitution and a stronger executive authority. But he needed a military figure to support the transition, someone who could ensure the plan succeeded if opposition appeared. At first, Size had considered other generals, but Napoleon was the best option. He had prestige, he had confidence, and most importantly, he had a reputation for winning. Napoleon also had something else. He had ambition that could not be satisfied by being someone else's tool. This alliance between Size and Napoleon was not built on friendship. Size needed Napoleon's force. Napoleon needed Size's political framework. Both believed they could control the outcome. Only one of them would be right. The plan was to overthrow the Directory through a legal-looking process. Not a violent revolution in the streets, not a sudden assassination, but a controlled coup that could be presented as necessary for stability. They would claim that France was in danger from radicals and conspirators. They would move the legislative councils out of Paris to a safer location. They would place troops in position to protect the government. And in the confusion, they would dismantle the Directory and replace it with a new system. This is where Napoleon's genius shows itself in a different way. He was not just a battlefield commander. He was becoming a strategist of power. The coup began on November 9, 1799. In the revolutionary calendar, it was 18 Brumaire, year the 8th. That date would become famous, not because it was dramatic in the way people imagine coups today, but because it marked the moment the revolution effectively ended and a new era began. Napoleon was appointed commander of the troops in Paris, supposedly to defend the Republic. The councils agreed to relocate to Saint-Cloud, outside the city, under the pretense of avoiding a threat. Troops moved into key positions. The Directory was pressured, resignations were arranged, the structure of government began to crack. On paper, it looked like a constitutional maneuver. In reality, it was a takeover, but coups are never as smooth as the planners imagine. Because once power is in motion, it becomes unpredictable. Napoleon expected the legislative councils to cooperate. He expected them to accept the new arrangement. He expected them to recognize his authority and the need for change. They were suspicious. They sensed that the Republic was being stolen from them. They shouted. They demanded explanations. Napoleon, used to commanding soldiers, found himself facing something he did not fully control, a room full of politicians. When Napoleon entered the Council of Ancients, he was met with tension but not open chaos. He spoke about danger, instability, and the need to save France. His words were not as sharp as his military plans, but he carried authority simply by being Napoleon. Then he entered the Council of 500. This is where the coup nearly collapsed. The 500 was larger, louder, and more hostile. Many deputies saw Napoleon's presence as intimidation. They shouted accusations, they called him a tyrant. Some even demanded he be declared an outlaw. Napoleon tried to speak, but the room was erupting. For a moment it looked like he might be physically attacked. The coup was slipping. This was the most dangerous point in Napoleon's career so far, not because he was facing an army, but because he was facing legitimacy. If the councils declared him an outlaw, any citizen could legally kill him. His supporters could turn away. His image could shatter. He could become another failed would-be dictator crushed by the revolution's remaining strength. Napoleon hesitated, not long, but long enough for danger to grow. And then his brother, Lucien Bonaparte, who was president of the Council of 500, played a crucial role. Lucien understood what was happening. He understood that the councils would not simply hand power over, so he used the moment to frame the narrative. He claimed that radicals inside the council were threatening Napoleon and threatening the Republic. He appealed to the soldiers outside, presenting the deputies not as lawful representatives, but as dangerous extremists. This mattered because soldiers respond to clear orders and clear enemies. Napoleon's troops entered. The deputies were forced out. Some fled through windows. The council was dispersed by military force. In that moment, the Republic's last legal barrier collapsed, and the coup succeeded. It did not succeed because Napoleon delivered a brilliant speech. It succeeded because when the political process resisted, Napoleon used the army. The revolution, which had once claimed to be the voice of the people, was now being reshaped by a man with soldiers at his back. The Directory was dissolved. A new government was created. The consulate. On paper it was a republic with 3 consuls. In reality it was Napoleon's system. Napoleon became first consul, the most powerful man in France. He was not yet an emperor. He did not yet wear a crown. But the core of the transformation had already happened. France had moved from revolutionary chaos into authoritarian stability, and Napoleon was the authority. This is where many people misunderstand Napoleon. They imagine he took power purely through violence. But the truth is more complex. Napoleon took power because France allowed it. Not in a formal vote, not with universal agreement, but through the collective exhaustion of a society that had lived through 10 years of instability. People were tired of governments collapsing, tired of war without purpose, tired of economic crisis, tired of fear. They wanted someone to take control and make life predictable again. Napoleon offered that, and he offered it with the confidence of a man who believed he was the only one capable of doing it. Once in power, Napoleon moved quickly. He did not waste time celebrating. He did not act like a temporary leader. He acted like a builder. He stabilized finances. He restructured administration. He restored order. He created the impression that France had finally found its center again. Napoleon also made peace where he could because he understood that endless war would eventually break the country. He sought stability not only through force but through reform, but he never forgot the lesson of Brumaire. Legitimacy can be manufactured. The law can be reshaped. Napoleon's coup was not the end of ambition. It was the beginning of control. He had climbed to the top of the Republic. Now he would remake it into something that could last. And once Napoleon began building, he did not build small. In the next chapter, Napoleon will transform himself from first consul into something even greater. He will reshape France's laws, its institutions, and its identity. And then, he will take the step that makes his rise unmistakable. He will crown himself. Because Napoleon is no longer content with saving France. He intends to rule it. Chapter 7. Emperor of France. He did not inherit it. He did not marry into it. He did not wait for tradition to hand it to him. He seized it in a moment of crisis, wrapped it in legality, and then began to reshape the country around his own vision. By 1799, he was first consul, the most powerful man in France. But Napoleon was not the type of man who sits comfortably inside someone else's system. He was the type of man who builds his own. And in the years that followed the coup of 18 Brumaire, Napoleon did something that many leaders talk about, but few can actually do. He stabilized a nation that had been collapsing for a decade. France under the Revolution had been chaotic. It had been unpredictable. Governments rose and fell quickly. Political factions fought each other constantly. Laws changed. Currency weakened. Fear ruled public life. People did not know what tomorrow would bring, and that uncertainty ate away at the country's strength. Napoleon understood that the first step to lasting power was not glory, it was order. So he moved with speed and discipline, as if France itself was a battlefield that needed to be reorganized. He strengthened the central government. He made administration more efficient. He placed loyal officials into key positions. He rebuilt institutions that the revolution had weakened. He brought stability to finances and encouraged economic recovery. He did not present these actions as dictatorship. He presented them as rescue, and in a sense, many French citizens saw it that way. They were tired of instability. They were tired of chaos. They wanted peace and predictability, and Napoleon gave them a version of it. But Napoleon was not only restoring stability. He was concentrating power. He reduced the independence of local authorities. He controlled the press. He limited political opposition. He made sure that the government's direction was determined by him, not by competing factions. This was not the free republic that revolutionary idealists had dreamed of. It was something else, a state built around one man. And Napoleon knew that if he wanted his system to survive, he needed more than military success. He needed legitimacy. Because France had executed a king. France had declared itself a republic. France had spent years fighting against monarchy. So how could Napoleon, a revolutionary leader, become something like a king without being destroyed by the very forces that had created him? The answer was careful transformation. Step by step, Napoleon used referendums to legitimize his authority, knowing that the public wanted stability enough to approve him. He became first consul for 10 years. Then he became first consul for life. Each step was presented as the will of the people. Each step increased his control, and each step made the next one easier. Napoleon also knew that power is not just law and administration. It is emotion. It is identity. It is the feeling people carry in their chest when they think about their country. So he began to craft France's national pride around his leadership. He supported public works. He promoted education. He encouraged science and engineering. He rewarded military achievement. He rebuilt France's image as a great power, not a revolutionary experiment destined to collapse. But his greatest domestic achievement, the one that would outlast his empire, was legal. The Napoleonic Code. Before Napoleon, France's laws were inconsistent and fragmented. Different regions had different legal traditions. The revolution had swept away many old laws, but it had not created a unified system that could function smoothly across the nation. Napoleon wanted a clear, centralized legal structure, something modern, something stable, something that could define the rules of society in a way that could not be easily torn apart by political chaos. The result was the Civil Code of 1804. Commonly known as the Napoleonic Code, it established equality before the law for male citizens. It protected property rights. It formalized contracts. It created a consistent legal framework across France. In many ways, it was a revolutionary achievement. It preserved some of the revolution's core ideas, like the end of feudal privilege and the principle that law should apply equally. But it also carried Napoleon's values. It reinforced authority, especially within the family. It restricted women's rights and placed them under the legal control of husbands and fathers. It prioritized social order over individual freedom. The Napoleonic Code was not pure liberty, it was structured society. It was the law of a state that wanted stability above all else. And it became one of Napoleon's most enduring legacies, influencing legal systems across Europe and beyond. While Napoleon was building domestically, he was also fighting. Because Europe did not stop being hostile to France simply because France stabilized itself. Britain remained an enemy. Austria remained a rival. Russia watched carefully. Prussia calculated its interests. The Revolutionary Wars continued, and Napoleon's victories made him more powerful, but also made Europe more determined to stop him. In 1800, Napoleon led a campaign in Italy, again defeating Austrian forces at the Battle of Marengo. The victory strengthened his authority at home and made it clear that he was still the most effective military commander in Europe. He also achieved a temporary peace with Britain in 1802 through the Treaty of Amiens. For a brief moment, it seemed like Europe might rest, but peace with Britain never lasted long. Britain distrusted Napoleon. Napoleon distrusted Britain, and the deeper truth was that both nations were competing for dominance. War returned, and as war returned, Napoleon's position became even stronger. Because France had always trusted him most when it was fighting, the question now was not whether Napoleon could rule France. He already did. The question was whether his rule could survive. Because the revolution had proven something terrifying. A government could collapse overnight. A leader could be executed. Power could vanish in an instant. Napoleon wanted to remove that uncertainty. He wanted his authority to become permanent. He wanted a dynasty. If his system depended on his personal presence alone, it would fall the moment he was gone. If his system was anchored in a hereditary empire, it could continue. And Napoleon, like so many rulers before him, believed his own leadership was the best guarantee of stability. So in 1804, Napoleon made his move. He declared himself Emperor of the French, not King of France. That distinction mattered. King sounded like the old monarchy. Emperor sounded like Rome, like greatness, like a new kind of authority that could rise above the revolution's old arguments. And Napoleon staged his coronation with careful symbolism. The ceremony took place in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. It was designed to look grand, historic, and sacred. The Pope, Pius VII, was present, giving the event religious weight, even though the revolution had weakened the Church's authority. But Napoleon did not intend to be crowned by the Pope. He intended to crown himself. And that is exactly what he did. In front of the Pope, in front of the French elite, in front of the world, Napoleon placed the crown on his own head. Then he crowned Josephine as Empress. The message was unmistakable. His authority did not come from God. It did not come from tradition. It did not come from a church, from his achievements, from his will, from his power. This moment was the final transformation. The revolution had begun by destroying monarchy. Now France had an emperor, and the irony was not lost on anyone. Some saw it as betrayal, a revolution that had fought for liberty now ruled by a single man. Others saw it as the natural conclusion, a decade of chaos finally replaced by stability. Many simply accepted it because Napoleon's government was effective and because France was winning. That is the uncomfortable truth about power. People often forgive a great deal if life feels secure and national pride feels strong. Napoleon's empire was not built only on fear. It was built on results. He continued reforms. He built roads. He improved administration. He strengthened education. He expanded opportunity for men who could prove themselves regardless of birth. At the same time, he expanded censorship. He strengthened police power. He limited political freedom. He demanded loyalty. He created a state that was efficient, modern, and controlled. Napoleon also began to build a new aristocracy, awarding titles and honors to loyal supporters. This too was ironic, because the revolution had destroyed the old nobility, but Napoleon understood that elites are useful. Titles create loyalty. Rewards create commitment. He was not restoring the old system. He was creating a new one, a nobility of achievement, tied to him personally. But the most important consequence of Napoleon becoming emperor was not domestic, it was international. Europe could tolerate revolutionary France for a time. Europe could tolerate a republic. But an emperor who conquered territory, rewrote borders, and threatened dynasties was something else. Napoleon's coronation was a declaration. France was not stepping back. France was stepping forward. And Napoleon intended to dominate the continent. The coalitions against him would grow stronger. The wars would become larger. The stakes would become higher. And Napoleon, now an emperor, would fight not just to win battles, but to maintain an empire that stretched across Europe. In the next chapter, Napoleon will reach the peak of his military power. He will defeat coalitions that seem impossible to defeat. He will reshape Europe's map like it is a piece of paper. And he will create a system of dominance that looks unstoppable, but every empire carries the seeds of its own downfall. Chapter 8, Europe Burns. By the time Napoleon crowned himself emperor in 1804, Europe had already made up its mind. This was not a temporary French leader. This was not a revolutionary experiment that would burn out. This was a new kind of ruler, backed by the most dangerous army on the continent and driven by ambition that did not stop at borders. The crowned Emperor of the French represented a direct threat to every monarchy in Europe, not only because he had taken power through revolution and war, but because he had proven he could win. And in international politics, a leader who wins repeatedly becomes more frightening than any ideology, so Europe prepared to fight him again. Britain, Austria, Russia, and others formed the Third Coalition, an alliance meant to stop Napoleon before he could grow even stronger. Their goal was not complicated: destroy Napoleon's army, force France back into its borders, end the Napoleonic threat. Napoleon's response was typical. He did not wait. He moved first. At this point, Napoleon had built the Grande Armée, the Great Army, a massive force trained, organized, and drilled to a level that made it one of the most efficient military machines the world had ever seen. It was not just large. It was fast. It was flexible. It was coordinated. Napoleon's genius was not only in tactics on the battlefield, but in how he structured war itself. He divided his forces into corps, self-contained units that could march separately and fight independently if needed, but also concentrate quickly when the decisive moment arrived. This made his army unpredictable. It could move like a swarm, spread out and then suddenly converge. It could outmaneuver slower, more rigid European forces. Napoleon's original plan in 1805 was to invade Britain. He gathered troops along the French coast, preparing for a crossing, but the British Navy, as always, stood in the way. Britain's strength was the sea, and Napoleon could not easily break that. When the Third Coalition formed, Napoleon shifted his focus. Instead of chasing the impossible dream of conquering Britain directly, he would crush Britain's allies on land. If Austria and Russia could be defeated, Britain would be isolated. That was the logic. And Napoleon moved with speed that shocked Europe. In late 1805, Napoleon marched his army from the French coast across Germany toward Austria. This movement was not slow and ceremonial. It was rapid and aggressive. It was designed to surprise and overwhelm. Austria, expecting a slower approach, found itself outmaneuvered. Napoleon's forces surrounded Austrian troops at Ulm, forcing a major surrender without even needing a massive battle. It was a humiliation for Austria, and a sign of what was coming. Vienna fell soon after, but the war was not over because Russia's armies were still advancing to join Austria. Napoleon wanted one thing: a decisive battle. He wanted to destroy the coalition's main force in one blow. And that is exactly what happened at Austerlitz. The Battle of Austerlitz, fought on December 2nd, 1805, is often called Napoleon's greatest victory. Not because it was his largest battle, not because it was his bloodiest, but because it was the purest demonstration of his ability to manipulate an enemy's mind. Napoleon faced a combined Austro-Russian army, led by Emperor Alexander I of Russia and Austrian commanders. The coalition had more troops than Napoleon, and they believed they could finally crush him. Napoleon allowed them to believe it. He deliberately weakened his right flank, making it look vulnerable. He positioned his army in a way that seemed hesitant. He appeared to be retreating. The coalition leaders saw an opportunity. They believed Napoleon was afraid. They believed he was about to escape. They believed they could strike his weak side, roll up his army, and win. So they committed their forces to the attack exactly where Napoleon wanted them to go. And Napoleon, watching carefully, waited for the moment. Then he struck. He launched a powerful assault into the weakened center, seizing the Pratzen Heights, the key terrain of the battlefield. Once the French controlled that high ground, the coalition army was split in two. The battle became a disaster for Austria and Russia. Their forces were divided, confused, and overwhelmed. Napoleon's troops pressed hard, cutting down retreating units, driving them into chaos. The coalition suffered massive losses and retreated in defeat. Austerlitz ended the Third Coalition. Austria sued for peace. Napoleon reorganized Germany into the Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of states aligned with France. In one campaign, Napoleon had reshaped Europe's political map, and he had done it with speed, deception, and ruthless precision. But Napoleon's dominance did not end with Austerlitz. In fact, it expanded. Prussia, watching these events, became alarmed. Napoleon's influence was spreading. German states were being reorganized. France was growing stronger. Prussia feared being surrounded and humiliated next. In 1806, Prussia joined a new coalition against France. Napoleon responded with another rapid campaign. At Jena and Auerstedt, Napoleon's forces crushed the Prussian army in a matter of days. The Prussian military, once considered one of Europe's best, collapsed under the speed and coordination of the French. Berlin fell. Prussia was broken. Napoleon pushed further east, facing Russian forces again. The fighting was harder now. The Russians were resilient. The terrain and weather were brutal. Battles like Eylau were bloody and inconclusive. But Napoleon kept pushing. In 1807, he achieved victory at Friedland, forcing Russia to negotiate. The result was the Treaty of Tilsit. It was a dramatic moment. Napoleon and Tsar Alexander met on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, symbolically separating their worlds and bringing them together. Napoleon appeared at the peak of his power. He had defeated Austria. He had crushed Prussia. He had forced Russia into an agreement. France now dominated continental Europe. But Napoleon still faced one enemy he could not defeat directly: Britain. Britain remained undefeated because Britain controlled the sea. Napoleon could win battles on land, but he could not invade Britain without naval superiority, and the British Navy was too strong. So Napoleon tried a different weapon: economic war. He created the Continental System, a policy designed to cut Britain off from European trade. The idea was to weaken Britain's economy by denying it access to markets and goods. On paper, it was a strategic move. In practice, it was a massive gamble, because enforcing the Continental System required control over Europe's ports and trade routes. It required cooperation from other nations. It required France to police the economy of an entire continent, and Europe did not always want to cooperate. Many countries depended on British trade. Smuggling became widespread. Local economies suffered, and resentment grew. Napoleon's dominance was impressive, but it created a new problem. The larger his empire became, the more it needed constant enforcement, the more he had to intervene, the more enemies he created. Napoleon also expanded his influence through family and political control. He placed his brothers and relatives on thrones across Europe, turning conquered regions into client kingdoms. This was meant to create stability and loyalty, but it often created resentment, because local populations did not want French rulers imposed on them, and Napoleon's relatives were not always capable. Some were corrupt, some were incompetent, some resisted Napoleon's control, and the empire began to feel stretched. Still, for a period, Napoleon looked unstoppable. His army was feared. His reputation was legendary. His administrative reforms were spreading. His victories had created a new European order, but under the surface, cracks were forming. One of the most dangerous places was Spain. Napoleon's attempt to enforce the continental system and control Iberia led to conflict, and Spain would become a bleeding wound for his empire. Because Spain did not fight Napoleon like a traditional European army, with ambushes, with guerrilla warfare, and that kind of war drains an empire slowly, day after day, without giving it a single decisive battle to win. Napoleon's dominance also depended on one thing that could not last forever: his personal presence, his ability to move faster than his enemies, his ability to concentrate force, his ability to intimidate. But as his empire expanded, Napoleon could not be everywhere, and the moment an empire depends on one man being everywhere, it begins to break. The peak of Napoleon's power was real. He was the master of Europe's battlefields. He was the architect of a new political map. He was feared by kings and admired by soldiers. But his system was also becoming heavier, more expensive, more demanding. And the longer it lasted, the more it required constant war to sustain itself. Napoleon had built an empire on momentum. And momentum eventually runs into something it cannot push through. In the next chapter, that resistance becomes undeniable. Spain will turn into a nightmare. And then, Napoleon will make the decision that destroys his army, shatters his dominance, and changes his fate forever. He will march into Russia. Chapter 9, The Cracks Appear. At the height of Napoleon's power, it was easy to believe the story was already finished. France dominated the continent. Austria had been humbled. Prussia had been crushed. Russia had been forced into negotiation. Napoleon's influence stretched across Europe through treaties, client states, and family rulers placed on foreign thrones. It looked like a new world order, a Europe that would bend around one man. But empires rarely fall in one dramatic moment. They begin to fail in smaller ways first. They develop weak points. They create resistance. They spread too far. They demand too much. And slowly, the system that once looked unstoppable starts to crack. For Napoleon, those cracks began in two places that could not have been more different. And Russia, one would bleed him slowly, the other would break him all at once. Spain became Napoleon's first major warning that his empire was not invincible. On paper, Spain should have been manageable. It was not one of Europe's strongest military powers. It was politically unstable. Its government was weak and divided. Napoleon believed he could control Spain the same way he controlled so many other regions, by installing loyal rulers, by enforcing French policy, by using military strength to keep order. But Spain did not respond like the rest of Europe. Spain responded like a nation that refused to accept humiliation. Napoleon's involvement in Spain escalated in 1808. Under pressure and manipulation, the Spanish royal family was forced to abdicate. Napoleon then placed his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the Spanish throne. To Napoleon, this was a logical move. To Spain, it was an insult. It was foreign domination disguised as political reform, and the Spanish people reacted with fury. An uprising erupted in Madrid. The French responded with violence, executions followed, and instead of crushing resistance, the brutality fueled it. Spain did not become a conquered territory that quietly accepted French rule. Spain became a war of national resistance. This was the beginning of the Peninsular War, and it was unlike the wars Napoleon preferred. Napoleon's genius was built for decisive campaigns, ambushes, sabotage, hit-and-run strikes, a constant drain. The word guerrilla itself, meaning little war, became part of the modern vocabulary because of this conflict, and it terrified the French. Because guerrilla warfare turns every road into danger, every village into uncertainty, every supply line into a target. An army can win every major battle and still lose the war, because it cannot control the countryside. That is what began happening in Spain. French forces could take cities. They could win battles. They could occupy territory, but they could not pacify the country. The Spanish resistance did not need to defeat Napoleon in open combat. They only needed to keep fighting, and they had help. Britain, still Napoleon's greatest enemy, saw Spain as the perfect place to strike him. Britain could not easily defeat Napoleon on the continent in a conventional war, but it could support resistance movements and force France into a long, expensive struggle. British troops landed in Portugal and Spain under commanders like Arthur Wellesley, who would later become the Duke of Wellington. This opened a new front, a constant battlefield that drained French resources year after year. Napoleon called Spain his ulcer. It was the kind of wound that does not kill you immediately. It weakens you. It infects you. It forces you to pour strength into holding something that never truly becomes secure. While Spain was bleeding Napoleon, the situation in Europe was shifting again. The continental system, Napoleon's attempt to destroy Britain economically by cutting it off from European trade, was causing problems. Many European states suffered under it. Smuggling increased, economies weakened, resentment grew. Russia, in particular, was becoming dissatisfied. At Tilsit in 1807, Napoleon and Tsar Alexander had appeared like partners. But that partnership was fragile. Russia's economy depended on trade, and the continental system hurt it badly. Russian nobles and merchants disliked it. The Russian government began to loosen enforcement. Napoleon saw this as betrayal. He had built his strategy around isolating Britain. If Russia broke the system, Britain would survive. And if Britain survived, Napoleon's empire would remain under constant threat. Napoleon also had personal reasons to distrust Russia. He believed alliances were temporary. He believed power relationships always shifted. And he believed that if Russia was not controlled, it would eventually become the center of a new coalition against him. By 1812, Napoleon decided that the only way to force Russia back into obedience was war. This was one of the most consequential decisions of his life. It was also one of the most catastrophic. Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen. The Grand Army, now expanded into a multinational force, included not only French troops, but also soldiers from allied and conquered states. Germans, Italians, Poles, Dutch, and others marched under Napoleon's command. The numbers were enormous, hundreds of thousands of men. A moving city of soldiers, horses, wagons, artillery, supplies, and support. Napoleon believed that sheer scale would guarantee success. He believed Russia would be forced into a decisive battle. He believed that once he defeated the Russian army, the Tsar would negotiate. He believed the campaign would be fast. That belief was his first mistake. Russia did not fight the war Napoleon wanted. The Russians retreated. They avoided major battle. They pulled back deeper into their territory. They used distance as a weapon. And as Napoleon marched forward, his supply lines stretched longer and longer. Disease spread. The army began to weaken before it even reached the main confrontation. Napoleon was chasing an enemy that refused to be caught. Finally, in September 1812, the Russians chose to stand and fight near Borodino, not far from Moscow. The Battle of Borodino was brutal. It was not a clean Napoleonic victory like Austerlitz. It was a slaughter. Tens of thousands died or were wounded in a single day. The French gained ground, but the Russian army did not collapse. It withdrew again, battered but still alive. Napoleon had won the battlefield, but he had not achieved the decisive destruction he needed. Still, Moscow lay ahead. Napoleon entered the city expecting it to be the prize that would force negotiation. He expected the Tsar to surrender. Instead, Moscow was largely abandoned, and then it burned. Fires erupted across the city, destroying supplies and shelter. Whether the fires were set deliberately or spread through chaos, the effect was the same. Napoleon had captured Moscow, but Moscow could not feed his army, and the Tsar did not negotiate. Napoleon waited. He stayed in the ruins of Moscow, hoping Alexander would send peace terms. None came. This was Napoleon's second mistake. Time. In Russia, time is lethal. Napoleon delayed too long, the weather began to change, and Napoleon's army, already weakened, was now trapped deep inside hostile territory with no secure supply base. Eventually, Napoleon ordered the retreat, and the retreat became the disaster that destroyed his empire. The French army marched back through frozen landscapes with little food and almost no shelter. Soldiers collapsed from exhaustion. Frostbite took fingers, toes, and limbs. Starvation turned disciplined men into desperate survivors. Russian forces harassed them constantly. Cossack cavalry attacked stragglers. Guerrilla units struck supply lines. The environment itself became an enemy. One of the most infamous moments came at the Berezina River, where the retreating army struggled to cross under attack. Thousands drowned. Thousands more died in the fighting. The Grand Army was not simply defeated, it was annihilated. Of the massive force that entered Russia, only a fraction returned. Napoleon's military reputation was built on invincibility. Russia shattered that image, and the consequences were immediate. Europe watched the disaster and realized something. Napoleon could be beaten. States that had feared him began to rebel. Allies began to reconsider loyalty. Enemies gathered strength. A new coalition formed, larger and more determined than ever. Napoleon still had skill. He still had leadership. He still had the ability to fight. But he no longer had the one thing that had made his empire possible. An army that could crush opposition wherever it appeared. The losses in Russia could not be replaced quickly. France could draft new soldiers, but it could not replace experienced veterans overnight. It could not replace horses and artillery at the same scale. It could not restore morale with speeches alone. Napoleon returned to France and began raising new armies, trying to rebuild strength through sheer will and organization. But now he was fighting against the tide of history. Spain continued to drain him. Russia had destroyed his core power, and Europe was closing in. Napoleon's empire had reached too far. It had demanded too much. And now the world that had once seemed powerless against him was rising together. He will fight brilliant defensive campaigns, winning battles even as he loses the war. He will be forced to abdicate. He will be sent into exile. And then, in one of the most dramatic returns in history, he will come back. One final march. One final battle that will decide everything. Waterloo. Chapter 10. Fall, Exile, and the Final Gamble. After Russia, Napoleon's empire did not collapse instantly. It began to collapse loudly. The destruction of the Grand Army in 1812 was not just a military disaster. It was a signal to the entire continent that the age of Napoleon might finally be ending. For years, European powers had fought him and lost. Again and again they had watched coalitions form and shatter. They had seen kings retreat, capitals fall, treaties signed under pressure, and borders redrawn at Napoleon's command. Russia changed that. Russia proved that Napoleon could be resisted, and once that lesson was learned, Europe moved quickly to act on it. In 1813, a new coalition formed against Napoleon, stronger and more determined than any before. Russia advanced westward. Prussia rose again. Austria, once Napoleon's reluctant ally, shifted back into opposition. Britain continued funding resistance and fighting through Spain. Napoleon's empire was now under pressure from every direction, and for the first time Napoleon was fighting without the advantage of overwhelming strength. His veterans were gone. His cavalry was weakened. His armies were filled with younger, less experienced soldiers. He could still command. He could still maneuver. He could still win battles, but the machine that had carried him to dominance was no longer at full power. Napoleon responded the only way he knew how. He fought. In 1813, he fought a desperate campaign in Germany, trying to hold his position and prevent the coalition from pushing into France itself. He won important victories early, including at Lutzen and Botzen, proving that his tactical brilliance was still real. But the coalition had learned too. They avoided direct confrontation when possible. They refused to be baited into the kind of battle Napoleon could control. They targeted his marshals. They attacked supply lines. They forced him into constant movement. And they brought numbers Napoleon could not match. The turning point came at Leipzig. The Battle of Leipzig, fought in October 1813, became known as the Battle of Nations because of the sheer scale of the forces involved. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers fought over several days. Napoleon faced a massive coalition army, and this time he could not break them. The battle was chaotic and brutal. Napoleon's forces fought hard, but they were overwhelmed. Allies defected mid-battle. Retreat routes collapsed. The French army withdrew, battered and weakened. Leipzig was not just a defeat, it was the end of Napoleon's dominance in Central Europe. After Leipzig, the coalition advanced toward France. Napoleon's empire outside France began to unravel. German states turned against him. His influence weakened. The client kingdoms he had built started to collapse. Meanwhile, Spain continued to drain French forces. Wellington's army and Spanish resistance pushed the French back, weakening Napoleon's grip on the Iberian Peninsula. By 1814, coalition armies crossed into France. This was the moment Napoleon had always tried to prevent. Foreign troops marching on French soil. The war had come home. Napoleon now faced the greatest challenge of his life, defending France itself. In early 1814, Napoleon fought what many historians consider one of his most impressive campaigns, not because he had overwhelming power, but because he didn't. With a smaller army, Napoleon moved rapidly across northeastern France, striking coalition forces in a series of battles. He won at Champaubert, Montmirail, Château-Thierry, and other engagements, using speed and concentrated force to punish enemies who were spread out. For a brief time, it looked like Napoleon might pull off the impossible, not by conquering Europe, but by saving France through sheer brilliance. But even brilliance has limits. Napoleon could win battles. He could not stop the coalition's numbers from closing in, and the coalition was not interested in negotiation that preserved Napoleon's rule. They wanted him gone. In March 1814, coalition forces entered Paris. That was the decisive blow. Napoleon was not in the city when it fell. His army was still maneuvering, still fighting, still trying to hold the line. But Paris was the heart of France politically and symbolically. Once it was taken, Napoleon's position became almost impossible to maintain. His marshals began to lose faith. His political support collapsed. Even those who had followed him for years began to calculate survival. Napoleon was forced to abdicate. In April 1814, he gave up the throne. The man who had crowned himself Emperor of the French, who had reshaped Europe, who had stood above kings, was now stripped of power. The coalition allowed him to keep the title of Emperor, but only as a formality. They exiled him to Elba, a small island off the coast of Italy. It was not a prison in the traditional sense. Napoleon was given a small guard. He was allowed to rule Elba as a tiny domain. But the message was clear. He was removed from Europe's center, removed from the armies, removed from the political stage. The world assumed the story was over. But Napoleon was not a man built to accept endings. On Elba, Napoleon watched events unfold. France, under the restored Bourbon monarchy, quickly became unstable. King Louis XVIII returned. supported by coalition powers, but many French citizens and soldiers did not love him. The old monarchy felt foreign after years of revolution and empire. The new government struggled to balance competing demands. Napoleon's former soldiers were discontent. Many people missed the order and pride Napoleon had created, even if they had suffered under his wars. Napoleon saw an opening, and as always, he moved. In February 1815, Napoleon escaped Elba. He sailed back to France with a small group of followers. It was an act of pure audacity when Napoleon landed in France. The government sent troops to stop him. This could have ended instantly, a quick arrest, a quick execution. The end. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The soldiers sent to capture him joined him. Napoleon approached them and spoke directly, offering himself, daring them to shoot if they truly wanted him gone. They didn't. They embraced him. They returned to his side. It was emotional. It was personal. It was built on years of shared hardship and victory. Napoleon marched toward Paris, and as he marched, more troops joined him. Officials defected. The restored monarchy panicked. King Louis XVIII fled, and Napoleon entered Paris again, without firing a shot. This period became known as the 100 Days, Napoleon's final return to power. But Europe would not tolerate it. The coalition powers reacted immediately. They declared Napoleon an outlaw. They mobilized armies. They prepared to crush him before he could rebuild his empire. Napoleon had little time. He needed a decisive victory quickly before the coalition forces could fully combine. His strategy was to strike in Belgium, where British and Prussian forces were gathering. If he could defeat them separately, he might force negotiation. It was the same logic he had used so many times before. Move fast, divide the enemy, win decisively. Napoleon moved north with his army. In June 1815 he fought at Ligny, defeating the Prussians. It was a victory, but not decisive enough. The Prussian army retreated, but it did not collapse. Napoleon then turned toward the British forces led by Wellington, positioned near a place called Waterloo. On June 18, 1815, Napoleon fought his final battle. Waterloo was not simply a clash of armies. It was the collision of Napoleon's entire legacy with the reality of a world that had adapted to him. The battlefield conditions were difficult. Heavy rain had soaked the ground, slowing movement and making artillery less effective. Napoleon delayed the attack, waiting for the ground to dry enough to support his guns. The British held strong defensive positions. They resisted French assaults again and again. Napoleon committed troops, including his elite Imperial Guard, hoping to break Wellington's line. But Wellington held, and then the decisive factor arrived. The Prussians. The Prussian army under Blücher returned to the battlefield and struck Napoleon's flank. Napoleon was now fighting two armies at once. His forces began to collapse. The Imperial Guard, once thought invincible, was repelled. The French army broke into retreat, and the battle became a rout. Waterloo ended everything. Napoleon returned to Paris, but his political support was gone. The government did not want another war. The people were exhausted. The coalition armies were advancing again. Napoleon abdicated for the second time. This time there would be no Elba, no second chance. Napoleon surrendered to the British. Instead, he was exiled to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, far from Europe, far from power, far from any possibility of return. On St. Helena, Napoleon lived out his final years. He dictated memoirs. He shaped his legacy through storytelling, presenting himself as a misunderstood hero, a man of destiny betrayed by circumstance and enemies. In 1821, Napoleon died in exile. But death did not end his influence. Napoleon's legacy is complicated because it contains contradictions. He spread revolutionary principles like legal equality and merit-based advancement. He also ruled as an authoritarian emperor. He modernized states and reformed laws. He also caused immense suffering through endless war. He inspired national pride in France. He also awakened nationalism across Europe that would later help destroy empires. Napoleon is remembered as a genius, a tyrant, a builder, a conqueror, a reformer, and a warning. And the reason his story still matters is simple. Napoleon proved that one person, under the right conditions, can reshape an entire continent. Not through magic, not through myth, but through ambition, discipline, and relentless will. And in the end, the same force that lifted him to the top also pushed him beyond the limits of what any empire can sustain. Because Napoleon did not just want to win, he wanted to be unstoppable, and history eventually stops everyone.